Is there such a thing as moral truth? Hi, I'm Mike Mason. This is the Immortal Combat Podcast. The Immortal Combat Podcast is the podcast arm of Viri Christi. Viri Christi is a Catholic lay apostolate devoted to help young men attain the full stature of Christ by growing strong in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can check us out online at virichristi.com. All right, fellas, this is the Intro to Moral Theology, episode 4. And we are wrapping up our intro to the intro unit we're doing here. We're going to turn our attention next week to the nature of the human person, which would be really cool stuff. I've already wrote that stuff out, so it'll be really cool. But we're wrapping up our intro. And what we did in this intro is we looked at what is the nature of ethics itself, what's moral theology. We talked about what kind of sources we have, faith and reason and things that help us figure out what the good moral life is. But before we move into actually doing moral theology instead of introducing it, I want to address the question of moral relativism. Okay, what moral relativism is it is the view that morality is relative to persons or places. Okay, the opposite of moral relativism would be moral absolutism or objective morality, however you want to put it. What that says is that there are moral truths, at least some, that are true for all people, at all places, at all times. Okay, so the question is, are there at least some moral truths that are true for everyone, everywhere, all the time, or are there not? The moral absolutist says, yes, there are some moral truths that are true for everyone, everywhere, all the time. The moral relativist says there is not. Okay, so what am I going to argue for? I'm going to argue that morality is objective and absolute, that there are some moral truths that are true for everyone, everywhere, all the time. But I also want to look at why a moral relativist says what he says and try to give you guys some insight why they're mistaken. Okay, because I'm sure in your guys' classes, moral relativism will come up at some point. If not, it hasn't already, it will in the future. So what is relativism? In philosophy, relativism is a view that truth is not absolute or certain. Okay, so it's a claim that truth depends upon like variable factors that change, like people, places, and times and circumstances. Okay, so they'll say something like this. They'll say, well, the truth is whether or not the room I'm sitting in is hot or cold, that's a relative truth. So we might be sitting in a room and I'm like, man, it's hot in here. And then some girl walks in, she goes, no, it's cold in here. Well, the truth of whether it's hot or cold, they'll say, well, look, that's relative, right? It changes, whether it's hot or cold changes based upon the person or what time of year it is or what place you're standing in. It's just relative. A relativist says all truth is like that, all of it, okay? Where now, one simple response to my example of the room being hot or cold, you could say, well, it's true that Mr. Mason thinks the room is hot, and it's true that Mrs. Mason thinks that it is cold. Okay, those are their opinions, but the truth is the room is 72 degrees. And that it being 72 degrees is a truth that's outside of both of us. So that's how you'd respond to something like that. Okay. But for relativists, they think all truths are like that. Right. Now, relativism applied to morality is just same sort of idea. Moral relativism is the idea that there is no unchanging moral principles, none. Okay. So they would say there's nothing inherently evil because what's good and bad, right and wrong, evil and such, that always depends upon social factors and customs and time and place and all that sort of stuff. Okay. And they might use an example of like how rules of modesty change, right? Like, well, back in the day, women, or in some, let me say it this way. In some cultures, women won't wear bathing suits, right? They just won't wear that. They won't go to the beach and wear bathing suits because that's immodest. Well, in one culture, that's true for them. In another culture, it's true that, a two-piece bathing suit's modest. Or in another culture, it has to be a one-piece. They'll say, look, all morality's like that. It just changes by situation. Okay. Time, place, whatever. All right. The reason why people think this is, for example, like what I just used. They'll say, listen, people's values change from culture to culture. They just do. Some cultures value one thing, some cultures value another. Individual people have different values. Okay. They'll say that morality is based primarily on situations. They'll say in some situations it's okay to lie, some situations it's not. So if your teacher asked you if you the homework you just did is yours, they'll say, you got to tell the truth when that happens. If the Nazis show up at your door and you're hiding Anne Frank up in the attic, they'll say, that one you don't have to tell the truth. Look, morality is relative. Okay. So they'll appeal to morality is relative by looking at these different value judgments. They'll say that, different situations color our morality. They'll say that, morality is like evolution. It's constantly evolving and changing, stuff like that. Okay. Why does this not work? And some of you guys are sharp enough to pick this up. If you are a moral relativist, okay, you're not saying that some questions of morality are relative or change. Let's say the application of modesty issues. You're saying all of them are relative. Okay. This is important. And this is a very difficult thing to defend, which is why most people don't do it. Okay. If you are a true moral relativist, what you are claiming is there's no standard of morality outside of our opinion, either our personal opinion or our cultural opinion. So let's take an extreme example. A moral relativist is going to say that they can't say that the Holocaust was evil in itself. They might say they didn't like it. They might say they didn't approve it, but they can't say it violated some objective moral law. Dude, that's obviously and completely false. Okay. There's no way to consistently say that morality changes for everyone and live in your day-to-day life. Okay. Because the most heinous example of morality that you could bring up, they have to say that's not intrinsically wrong. And guys, practically speaking, almost no one's going to say that. So when you meet someone who says things like, well, morality is relative, it changed for everyone. Okay. They might have some, sophisticated questions in that we won't get into today, but there's answers, to all of them. One thing you just point out, say, listen, you can just use a heinous example like the Holocaust. So I'm saying, do you think that's wrong for everyone everywhere all the time? And most people say yes. You go, oh, okay, well, there you go. We agree there's at least one rule, which is moral absolutism. So that's kind of how you handle that. I know I'm not walking through kind of each nuanced part of their view and walk through, but that's the basic way you respond to people who make that claim. Guys, what we are is what's called moral absolutists. Okay. Now, when I say we are, I'm implying you are. What I'm going to teach is more absolutism. What that means is that there are things that are morally true. Okay. And those truths match up with reality. Okay. So there are certain moral laws and moral principles that are true for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That's what moral absolutism is. Now, I'm not claiming the list of these is gigantic, but what I am arguing is that there are some moral truths that are objective, eternal, and universal. That means they're true for all people at every time and in every place. For example, it is absolutely immoral to torture young children in every time, every place, always. That never changes. That's a law that you can't do. Think of like the 10 commandments, right? Thou shalt not kill innocent persons. That's true for everyone, everywhere, all the time. Okay. So what we claim as Catholics is that there are certain moral truths that are true for everyone, everywhere, all the time. Now, granted, once you know these moral truths, you have to apply them to your life. So there's an aspect of morality that is subjective, okay, or relative that kind of changes. So you do have to apply these things. That is true, okay? But what a moral relativist does is they confuse that application with the law. So they say, oh, well, the application, you have to apply it to my circumstances, therefore there's no law. That does not follow. No, there are moral laws that do need to be applied. And we'll talk about this in greater depth later on like how you do that well, okay? So don't be confused by the relativists. There are moral principles that are true for everyone, everywhere, all the time. Yet we do need to apply them, and we're going to look at some helpful tools to do so. So that was a little bit heavy this week, but I'm under the time limit, which is good. We'll stop there. Next month, we're going to get into what is the nature of the human person. So if God's trying to turn us into certain kind of men, we have to know what a human person is so that we can have a clear idea of what he's trying to turn us into. So that'll be next week. Now, I hope you guys have a blessed week, and I'll talk to you next time.